This is a Parshat podcast brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study, and I'm your host, Yosefa Fogel-Rubel. Let's learn. Welcome back to our Shemot series, First Principles of Nationhood, where we're exploring what axiomatic ideas sit at the root of Israel's national formation, without which we wouldn't be who we are. How might we adjust our current trends in the Jewish world to realign with these principles? This week's episode is dedicated in memory of Rabbi Desmond Maizels, Harav Tzivin Yeshayahu V'Freda, who passed away 4 years ago. Rabbi Maizels was a devoted community rabbi in Cape Town, South Africa for over 40 years, who saw to the communal, personal, and halachic needs of the Jewish community there with unflagging dedication. For those of you who love listening weekly, sponsoring an episode is a wonderful way to show your gratitude for the high-level content we try and put out each week. Be in touch with us at podcast@matan.org.il or with the Matan office to sponsor other Shemot episodes. Parshat Beshalach begins as the Israelites leave Egypt and ends with the war against Amalek. In this light, on their way to freedom, the nation is flanked by military obstacle. The emotion of regret also features central in our Parsha. First, God is concerned that the people might regret their exit from Egypt and thus takes them on a different route farther from Egyptian troop encampments. Next, we learn that Paro and his servants regret their allowance of the Israelites' exit. The chase is on until the Egyptians are sunk into the depths of the ocean, while the Israelites walk through safely to the other side. After the miraculous sea crossing, Kriyat Yam Suf, we meet a series of complaints as the people begin their travels in the desert. Not enough water, not enough food, not enough meat, not enough water. Again, this initial exit is really disheartening. The transition into a new supernatural existence requires more effort and faith than they anticipated. It feels a bit like boot camp or tirunut in Hebrew, and like most young soldiers report, it's a pretty disastrous moment in time as one adjusts to entirely new circumstances, however temporary they may be. This is because the change is not merely physical from a land of plenty to the desert's desolation, but also theological. They have supplanted a human master for a monotheistic relationship with God, which will take most of the biblical period to solidify. I'm really excited to introduce my guest for today, new to the podcast, Rabbi Joe Wolfson, who is the rabbi and co-director of the JLIC Young Professionals Community in Tel Aviv. Previously, he and his wife, Corrine, spent 7 years as the directors of the JLIC downtown at the Bronfman Center of NYU. Rabbi Joe Wolfson, it's a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
You know, we are going to unpack the Kriyat Yam Suf, the crossing of the Red Sea story, from a very unique angle today. But before we get into that conversation, I actually wanted you just to take a moment to explain to our audience what it is exactly, what does it mean to be the rabbi and director, as you and your wife together, of the JLIC community in Tel Aviv. What does that look like?
Sure. So we came back to Israel about 2.5 years ago from 7 years in New York. We live in Tel Aviv, and your listeners may or may not know that Tel Aviv has a thriving and growing community of many olim, hundreds of recent arrivals in Israel from English-speaking countries, as well as from non-English-speaking countries. And what we get to do is we get to create this really vibrant and exciting Jewish religious life and Jewish communal life, which is integrated into local shuls in Tel Aviv. The community's diversified over the last couple of years as well, so that it's now no longer by any means exclusively an Olim community. It's also many people who have lived all their lives in Israel. And we really try to view the city as the canvas on which we work. To build a great community, not just in a place, but of a place that relates very much to the neighborhood and its rhythms. And it's been a pretty tumultuous 2 years, as I'm sure all of your listeners will know. Tumultuous on the outside, and that's given us a lot of opportunities to build connections to the current moment, be that the war, be that religious, secular relations within the city. And obviously we're going to be talking about Torah today as well. Torah exists, I guess, in the abstract in a certain sense, but it also very much exists in relationship to the place in which it's being learnt and taught. And so that's also been a very powerful dimension of our work over the last couple of years. It's wonderful. It's fun. There's lots of energy. There's lots of vibrancy, different programming happening. And people should come and visit.
Does this include like a weekly shul alongside all of your communal events? Or is it, you said it's spread out in different shuls. I'm just curious what that means.
There is one particular shul which we are very much connected to. It's the Ben Yehuda 126 synagogue. It's a beautiful old shul, pre-state, sort of really like early 20th century architecture. Yeah. There's a big plaque on the wall of all the members of the community who lost their lives fighting in 1948. And about 15 years ago, the shul was very close to locking the doors and throwing away the key. It had declined. The community had really died out, moved on. And a small group of people said, no, we're gonna try and turn it around. And now, I mean, I'm biased, but I think it's one of the wonders of the Jewish world. If you get there past a certain time on a Shabbat morning, it's very much standing space only. And it's kind of representative and symbolic of the transformation of the city, or the religious renaissance that's taking place in the city. So we have a very special relationship with the shul. That's where we are mostly, but we also work with a number of other communities as well. And it's a great place to be able to try some really creative experiments in what Jewish community can be.
Yeah, phenomenal. I'll just say, like, in the backdrop of this is obviously that in Israel, the idea of community and strong communal structure is something that we've kind of brought back from diaspora world into Israel. And so obviously, yes, you're working with a predominantly English-speaking group of people, some of whom have been here forever and some who are new. But it's a concept that's really caught fire all throughout Israel in the past decade. There's much more of a desire for people to be part of communities as well. And I think people have realized that that's one of while we have a broad community of a nation here and we're connected by all these national norms, people have realized that there's a tremendous advantage, just lifestyle wisdom in living as part of a community structure.
And in this particular sense, it's an actual import from North America, in that we worked as the JLIC directors and couple at New York University for 7 years. And JLIC, which is a North American OU college-based program, initially about 7 years ago made a pivot to Israel as well. And now, I think as of this year, there are 11 separate communities across Israel, stretching from Haifa in the north to Beersheba and Ben Gurion in the south. And cumulatively, you've got communities being created for thousands of initially young Olim, allowing them to take their first steps in Israel in a very sort of supportive environment to build their connections, but then also broadening into building community within Israel itself. Ben Gurion in Beersheba, for example, is primarily an Israeli program, and that's something very, very new in Israel.
Yeah, phenomenal. Okay, thanks for sharing that with us. Just thought our listeners would be fascinated to hear about it if they haven't yet been exposed, either from themselves or maybe their children. And I wanted us to sort of come back into our conversation about the Parsha. We today are actually going to be looking at the crossing of the Red Sea, of Kriyat Yam Suf, through the prism of several midrashim that are, again, you'll bring us on that journey that have both, of course, relevance in the story itself and really resonate in a lot of what we've experienced over the past year and a half. I guess I just wanted to before I turn it to you and ask you about our first midrashic source, just wanted to sort of think together for a moment about what this whole, Song of the Sea is. It's very unusual. I would say it's also the first time that Am Yisrael have a voice in this story, meaning they cry out, God hears them. That's the end of Shemot Perek Bet of chapter 2. And then they're completely silent until we get towards the 10th plague. We physically don't hear from them through all of that time that we were having the plague sequence throughout Egypt. And here we really have like a triumph of their singing together, and it's born probably out of a whole host of emotions, right? Of a triumphant feeling of victory over their enemies. Obviously, it's a song of praise to God. It's actually mostly a song of praise to God. It only mentions the Egyptian context in a few places, but it's just a milestone for the nation that they do something together. They join together. I mean, right after this, it's, as I said in my introduction, it's going to go really downhill. They're not going to show a tremendous amount of unity. They're going to immediately be dissatisfied. But at least for that small moment in time, we not only have a way to remember the victory that happened, and we sort of monumentalize it with this song, but we also have a moment where they're unified in their experience right before they sort of fall back into the transition that will obviously take much longer than this one moment. This song really has, is monumental in so many ways. It also possibly very much sort of inspires them for the future. And of course, we also have the separate song of the women, which I'm not sure we'll probably get into today, but that also is interesting. Also, for the first time, to hear Miriam's name and to see the women also as their own unit. But I was wondering if you could bring us into sort of, first of all, why it is really that you feel that these, specifically the midrashim surrounding Yam Suf, are particularly poignant for you, and also bring us into the first one.
Sure. I guess, before we get into the midrashim, thinking with the points you've just made, I think the verse that precedes the Shirah is a very interesting framing. Vayiru ha'am et Hashem vayaminu b'Hashem u'Moshe avdo. They see God, they believe in Hashem and Moshe as Hashem's servant, and it's this moment of kind of religious understanding of a vision of God which doesn't seem to have much precedent in Tanakh. This idea of vayaminu, they believed it. It's ironically a very rare statement.
Totally.
In Tanakh as a whole, and this is the moment where they have it. But even though it's so exceptional, there's also something very quotidian, like very dated, that become. This is the part of Shemot that we include in our daily tefillah. Right, this is towards the end of Pesukei de Zimra every morning, weekday and Shabbat. So despite its exceptional moment, there's also something day to day about it. Why midrashim? So this is more at the feeling level than anything particularly worked out, and I don't know if you and others listening who live the parasha each week have something similar. But there are certain. I love midrashim in general, as well as loving more pshat based approaches. But there are certain passages, certain stories or elements within Chumash which I feel, to really get into them, I need to live in the midrashim. Yaakov alone at night, struggling with a mysterious adversary. That's a topic which your brain and your heart works differently with that text if you approach through the midrashim rather than approaching through a classical reading of the text with mefarashim. And Beshalach and Kriyat Yam Suf is, for me, really an element of that. The midrashim are able to tap into so many different dimensions of the passage, and that's what I like to. That's what I find so interesting and so diverse with each other.
By the way, just one piece on that is that I think that part of the issue is that when you read the pasuk you just read, Vayaminu b'Hashem Moshe avdo, and then you read the song, and then immediately after, right? It's just, we go right into the next piece, and they're miserable, right? And so it's also, I think, because of the way that the Torah is written, because of the fact that Shira itself, right, this really like ancient version of poetry, like a prosaic poetry, also feels very far from us, that there's something that we almost like can't like can't really hold on to anything. It's difficult. It's hard to relate to, and it's over before you even feel like it began. I think that we experience that a little bit also with Makat Bechorot, or the actual Yetziat Mitzrayim, not Makat Bechorot, but the actual Yetziat Mitzrayim. Like we were out before we even realized we were leaving. Like the Torah doesn't necessarily spend so much time on moments that clearly in the experiential side of them were tremendous. And I think that that's where the midrashic depth really comes out, because you think to yourself, well, what did they think? What were they experiencing? Really? Everybody believed the same thing? I've never met a Jewish people where everybody believed the same thing. So you have these questions about what did that lived experience look like? I see the text that's, been chosen as the summary text of that experience. But I think that just the midrash opens up the world of human diversity that we know must have been there. But the Torah, that's not the way it's telling us the story.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's beautifully said, and that's one of the ways in which to frame why a midrashic lens on this is, I think, so valuable. Shall we begin with the first one?
Yes, please.
So the first one is one that I knew before I'd ever seen it in the text. I think it gets spoken about quite a bit, and it's this beautiful and in certain ways almost humorous description of the praise given not by Am Yisrael in general, but by the very, very young who are there at the time. Chazal have the desire to show that there is a level of appreciation and understanding of God that is present at Kriyat Yam Suf, which is not anywhere, and which doesn't have any other parallel. And one of the ways in which they show this is that even the smallest children, Amru Shira, they sang the song as well. They were sitting on their mother's knee, perhaps they were even breastfeeding, and at that moment they release their mother as they see the Shekhinah, they see God, they see God's presence, and they say, Ze keli v'anvehu. This is my God, and I will glorify him. And that's a very central and powerful verse within the Shira, and in this midrash's reading, and this is a Gemara actually in Masechet Sotah, Ze keli v'anvehu, that is the children who are saying, this is my God. There's a Gemara elsewhere in Masechet Sotah, which is clearly in conversation with this midrash, that Ze keli v'anvehu is actually this. It's like, oh, I recognize him. I've seen him before. And you might be familiar, I believe they're in the first perek of Masechet Sotah, these very painful midrashim about the experience of the children in slavery, and the children being born in the fields and sort of birth as a rebellion against Egyptian tyranny, and God protecting the children in the furrows and covering them so that the Egyptian taskmasters wouldn't take them away and find them and kill them. And God has protected them in the fields of slavery, and then they see God again at the sea a few months later maybe and say, Ze keli v'anvehu, yes, this is my God. And then the midrash carries on, and it's beautiful, and it goes a step further, and it says not only the children on their parents' knee or breastfeeding infants, afilu ubarim shebamei iman, even not yet born children, still in their mother's womb, they also sang Shira as well. They were able, Mimakor Yisrael, verse in Tehillim, from Makor, in that sense, understanding from the womb, they were able to see it. And the Gemara asks a very Gemara-type question: how could they see it? Surely their mother's body was in between them. And we were given the beautiful phrase that Na'aselahen ka'aspaklaria ha'me'ira, that their mothers became sort of transformed into like luminous crystal, and they were able to see through them. So just on its own terms, I love this midrash, but like what happens with a lot of midrashim, at first glance, it's a simple story, almost a childlike story. Like for those of us who have young children, I could easily share this with my children and they'd love it, and that would work very well, that they would, my the little children would appreciate the idea that little children are seeing God, or babies in the womb, etc. But then what often happens with midrash is looked at differently, or it will suddenly take a different turn, which will take it to a much deeper place, and perhaps a darker place as well, and make it relate to significantly more adult questions. The way in which I think we first begin to see this is which verses the midrash draws on. A verse which it uses is mipi olalim v'yonkim isadata oz, from the mouths of breastfeeding children, of little infants, God will be established in strength. And that's a verse from Tehillim chapter 8. And if you go and look at Tehillim chapter 8, which is a well-known mizmor, it features the following line: Ma enosh, what is man? What is humanity? Ki tizkerenu, that God should consider it, which is an amazing line. Like, who is humanity? Why are we worthy of God's attention? And in a parallel midrash to this, it is the angels who are asking that question. And they say, God, why are you putting so much effort into this thing called humanity? Are they really worth it? And in the midrash, God responds and says, no, they're really good. Okay, they're really, really good, and I'm going to give you an example of it that's going to prove it. And the verse which is going to prove it is going to be something about little children. Right? Mipi olalim v'yonkim, and it's the experience of the little children that is going to show and demonstrate to the angels that in fact humanity is worth it. And in this parallel midrash, it's in the Tosefta in Masechet Sotah, it is the children singing the song of praise to God at the sea, which is this sort of clinching argument that God gives that humanity really is worth it. And the angels then respond with another verse in the Mizmor, Hashem Adonenu ma'adir shimcha b'chol haaretz. Now we get it. How majestic is your name throughout the land, mipi olalim v'yonkim, through the mouths of young children. And it could just end there, and it would be wonderful and worthwhile. But then, and this is another thing you sometimes have with midrash, is you think it's just saying one thing for the first 98% of the word count, and then it flips it in the last couple of words. Then we're introduced to a different opinion, and this is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. And Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh, just to explain the context of what he's going to be saying, he is agreeing with this reading of Tehillim chapter 8, that it's a debate between God and the angels about whether or not humanity are worthwhile. Do they deserve God's attention and providence? And in the midrash, Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh will agree that indeed they are, and the clinching proof is the children, mipi olalim. But his disagreement with, I believe it's Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, is that it's not the children at the sea who are the example of why it was worth it. And I'll just read his words. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh Omer, Lo ne'emra parasha zu, ela al Yitzchak ben Avraham le'inyan Akedah. This whole story is not about the kids at the sea, it's about the Akedah, and specifically, it's about Yitzchak at the Akedah. What is the example of mipi olalim, or from the mouths of a young child, praising God, that makes humanity worthwhile? Not Shirat Hayam, but the Akedah. And you just sit back from that, and if people want to see this inside, if they haven't got access to the Tosefta, the Baalei HaTosfot, in their commentary on Masechet Sotah, they bring the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh. You sit back and you think, what on earth is going on here? What on earth does this mean? We've sort of got set up almost as competing archetypes, the children at the sea and Yitzchak, the child at the Akedah, of which one, they are the competing proofs for God to give to the Malachim as to why it's worthwhile.
So if I could just jump in for a minute, we have the first level, as you said, of this midrash is basically, this is a lovely way of sort of broadening our view of how people were engaged in this event, right? Meaning the first level is, the children were there, the children noticed, the children are excited, and that gives like a first I imagine like a lightning bolt, like a first piece of like, you're in something that could objectively be very, very scary. But it almost feels that like the children come and they see the wonder of the scenario. And there's something very tamim. There's something very sweet and kind and pure about that reaction. In the case of Yitzchak, right? So first of all, obviously it's ironic because he doesn't actually speak, meaning there's really nothing to go on in the story itself. There's hineni, okay? So meaning that's probably what they're going on in terms of the speech, but it's more of like a wholesome ability to be present with God. Like those are those two moments. Like the Akedah, it becomes this like paradigm of what it means to align yourself with God's will, even when it seems utterly confounding. And the story of Kriyat Yam Suf, which we look at as triumphant because we knew the end, but I imagine in reality was kind of pretty scary until they realize that it's phenomenal, is that the young children are looking at it and saying, wow, this is amazing. Or I could see the fish, through the walls of the ocean. And so like one of them is a triumphant moment and one of them is a really scary moment, but the devotion of the child along with the father makes it a triumphant moment of belief, meaning the tone of the stories are very, very different, but it's a place where we see a child identifying their will with the will of God.
That's very interesting as to what does the Akedah mean for Yitzchak. I think the line you just said was that the Akedah has its significance because it's the ability to align oneself with God's will even in the hardest of circumstances. That, to me, definitely describes Avraham. Does it describe Yitzchak at the Akedah?
Because you think that for him it wasn't difficult?
I wonder. Maybe it's simply his presence within that unimaginably difficult moment. The way in which I've thought about this machloket in the Tosefta is as sort of through an ahava and yira paradigm. That the children at the sea are this ahava. They are wow. They are overwhelmed with the presence of the Shekhinah. Zekeli v'anvehu. I'm sure there's elements of deep gratitude in it, of awe and wonder. And the Akedah seems to be the perfect example of yira. That it is the fear, the pachad of Yitzchak that comes through from that moment. And maybe what I like about this midrash is, and I think why so many of these midrashim are so powerful, is they're not just tales in and of themselves. They lead one to think, what are the moments in which we justify our existence? If there are malachim somewhere looking down at us and thinking, do these people are they worth it? And is it in the moments of greatness and awe and wonder, that the children at the sea type moments, or is it in the moments of yira, the moments of the hardest times which the Akedah seems to represent?
I think also just the fact of the children is a piece here that the Midrash is really trying to highlight, meaning when we feel exasperated by the adults, or when we feel that there's really no hope left for those people, it's hard to change them, which I think works more for the Yetziat Mitzrayim generation than it does for the Abraham example. Then if we want to feel hopeful, we just have to look at the younger generation because they're malleable. They're able to be they're able to be educated and see, how wondrous this scenario was. I don't want to take any of your examples, but I think obviously I think about the past year. By the way, I even think about the past year just in the case of not even that my kids were an example of wonder or devotion, but simply that children make adults function better. Obviously, they also can make us function worse. But when you're in a very extreme scenario, having somebody else to care for can often pull us, into our more functional selves. And I feel like that's been something that I've been grateful. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I, can't, dissolve into a pit of dysfunction if I have to, get 5 people to a particular space. Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I feel like
got time for that. Yeah.
Exactly. So that as adults, like sometimes we dafka look at our kids in order to sort of reflect back to us what might be like the core reaction or the core principle here. Again, obviously this is very limited, and very often kids do not yet know how to function or to keep all their faculties in check, obviously. But sometimes they can be instructive for us. And they certainly are instructive, just the fact that we have to keep ourselves together so that we can care for them.
And I think if we are thinking in the experience of the last year, the kids doesn't necessarily mean the 1-year-olds, the 2-year-olds, the 3-year-olds. It also means the young generation, the 18, 19, 20-year-olds who were, called the TikTok generation as a pejorative, as a generation who, cared more about their smartphones than about anything of significance beyond them, and who have, I'll say I've spent the last 2 days hiking in the north, very near the Lebanese border, absolutely beautiful, with my cousin's son. And this time a year ago, he was in hospital after the house he was in Gaza had been hit by a rocket, and his body was full of shrapnel, and he spent 10 months in hospital. And he's 22. To be able to hike with him over this last year, he just sort of seems to me to be able to contain and embody the gvura of this generation that we've seen. A friend of mine who is in his early 40s but still does miluim at one point said to me, he said, even if the absolute worst happened, I've spent so much time with Sadirnikim, and I feel they could build the state again themselves. The quality of this young generation, and I think that thinking with these midrashim, whether it's the Bibas children, or whether it's the dancing youth at Nova, or whether it's the soldiers of my cousin's son age who we're talking about, you can take the very young, and you can take the youth as a prism for the experiences of this last year.
I guess one other piece I wanted to add to that understanding, but it's to kind of flip it on its head, is that in my experience, having my kids at home and trying to, kind of observing how they're going through it. My kids are 12 and a half and down. Okay. I don't have any, that's a significant piece to put here. That in the Midrash, we have the children are the ones who say, Ze keli vanvehu. It's their voice that recognizes God. And I find that sometimes my question for myself as a parent is, what is the sentence, or what is the refrain, or what is the point that I want them to sort of store in their heart memory from these moments? Like that dafka as a parent, I feel that it's my job a little bit, just like I've said this before on the podcast, but like our family rule is that you go on Tiulim, the kids are always crying and yelling and unhappy, and you keep a whole training them for like some ethic that I hope one day will redeem itself. Okay. But it's always slightly unpleasant. But the point is that no matter what you do, you print out pictures of everybody smiling, and everybody remembers that it was like a fantastic experience. And over the past year and a half, in the exact opposite scenario, okay, where things were terrible in many regards, and there were also very triumphant moments, which I know we'll get to in a little bit. My question for myself has been, like, what is that zekili vanveo? What is that phrase, or what is that emotion that I kind of want to make sure gets like etched in their heart from this experience? So while sometimes the children can reflect back to us, as I think the initial layer of the midrash that we're bringing is, it seems to be what it's reflecting, I guess the question for me becomes like, what is it that the parents say or do or experience, or political views that are expressed, is it that I really want the children to remember? Obviously, I don't have full control over that, but I do have a certain degree of control over the dialogue in my home, or, those kind of pieces. So I'm just putting that out there. Obviously, I'm really more projecting my experience onto this text than like the text itself is saying, but I think that the opposite question really also occupies a lot of what I think about, as I see my 12-and-a-half-year-old develop pretty acerbic language, describe lots of things around her that she really doesn't have full understanding of. Okay, but yeah. So why don't we see our next midrash?
Sure. So the next midrash is very different in a number of ways. Firstly, the first midrash that we looked at had a substantial word count, and we just talked around it and said a few quotes from it. This is an example of a midrash which is just a few words. It's also an example of a midrash of the theological chutzpah and the theological license which Chazal allow themselves in midrash, which, lulei omro, were it not to be said by a hallowed text, we could never say it ourselves. And it takes as its source text the verse in the Shirah, in the Song of the Sea, Mi kamocha be'elim Hashem, who is like you amongst and you can translate Elim as the gods, as the powerful ones. The translation that I have in front of me says the celestial ones. Elim means the great things of the world, but nobody is like God. God is God is the greatest of all of the Elim. And in the following midrash, this appears in Masechet Gittin. We have, in the name of Debei Rabbi Yishmael's academy, you should not read it as Mi kamocha be'elim Hashem, who is like you amongst the Elim, rather Mi kamocha be'ilmim. The addition of a mem in the middle of a verse, of a word, not elim, but ilmim. Ilem means to be a mute, who is like you, God, amongst the mute ones, which is just the most remarkable, astonishing, outrageous phrase. Not only are you mute, God, but your muteness is of a degree greater and more powerful, more significant, and maybe more mute than any other muteness that there is, which is a very strong, brave statement to say in any case, but to take as its root verse a verse which says the total opposite of it, seemingly. And Kriyat Yamsuf is the example of, God is Ish Milchama. He is a man of war, and his presence is so great that it even overwhelms the babies in their mother's wombs, as we've just seen. And Debei Rabbi Yishmael take and turn and say, this is about God's muteness.
Okay, so I just want to unpack that for a second, because first of all, at this point, God is mute vis-a-vis the Jewish people, meaning he has not revealed himself to them. We have everything being funneled through Moshe and through Aharon. Ironically, later when God does try and speak to the people, they don't like it very much. And they become, sort of, oh, no, keep that away. I don't want that very close. But how do you, meaning, is this a compliment to God? Do you think this is an insult to God? Meaning, did the ancient gods speak? I don't think they did, by the way, but maybe it's because the ancient gods had, not in all cultures, in an Egyptian culture, they didn't have really, the human representation maybe was paro. But I'm just curious, like in the eyes of the Midrash, is this something negative? It adds like a scariness of God that he feels very far away.
Very interesting what you're saying. I think you're tilting at a softer reading of the Midrash than I have. But to go with your reading of it for a minute, to understand the Ilem, the muteness of God, as simply being that Moshe has heard God speak until now, but the people have not. That's really interesting. There was a comment of the Netziv on Parshat Va'era, which I noticed this year, and I thought was very interesting, when Moshe complains that he is aral safatayim. He's not able to speak. And God follows up by saying, I think this is at the end of Perek Vav or the beginning of Perek Zayin, Nataticha Elohim lefaro. I have made you into a god to Pharaoh, and Aaron will be your prophet. The Netziv has got this, I think, brilliant reading. You will be a god to Pharaoh in that you will be completely silent. You will not speak.
Oh, interesting.
Right? What you feel is your disability and is sort of embarrassing and demeaning. Actually, we're going to turn that silence, and we're going to make that silence into your strength and power. And Paro is going to feel like he's not worthy of being, and your silence is your power.
It's like it's like a mystique. It's like a mystique of Moshe.
Yeah, and I love that sort of like Godfather imagery, if you forgive the reference. I never understood it as this midrash is referring to that, though. I think what midrash frequently allows itself to do is to be quite untethered from the pshat. And I think what the way in which I've understood this midrash, and it's partly because there's a cluster of other sources which continue this direction, is right now at the sea, Am Yisrael say, Mi kamocha ba'elim. God is so powerful, there is no power like you. But there will be other moments in history where God is ilem, where God does not speak and God does not act, but God is silent. We have this verse in Yeshayahu, which Rabim b'nei shomama mi b'nei bu'ula. Greater are the children of the desolate one than the children of the B'nai Bu'ula, the one living in happy, good times. And the famous teaching of Chazal on that verse is that Harbe tzadikim ha'emidu li b'churbana yoter mi b'binyana. That greater tzadikim, greater people arose in times of destruction than in times of binyana, than in times of when the temple stood and everything, as it were, was as it was supposed to be. There's some deep paradox here, that in the darkest moments, and now this midrash is focusing on the people, right? It brings out the greatest of the potential within the people and within individuals in a way in which in happier, sunnier times does not take place.
Right, and if you put those together, in those happier times, Kivachol, God feels more present, and in those darker times, I don't know if this is where you're going with it, but in those darker times, that's where Kivachol, God is mute, and when God is mute, so humans kind of come and take the place and say, I got to step up because I don't see anybody else taking control.
Well, so fair. So it's exactly where I'm going with it, and here is where I need to pay my big debt of gratitude to Rav Yitzchak Hutner. I know in the past you've had a series on, who is your hero? Who are you going to use?
No, I just like to talk about them regularly. Yeah, yes, the biblical superheroes. And
so Rav Hutner really is one of mine. I find him one of the deepest, most powerful and profound thinkers. And he
he did spend time in England, right? So
did he?
Did he not? Oh, that was Rav Dessler. Nope, sorry. Wrong one.
Both students of Slobodka,
but you managed to get in Pachad Yitzchak there earlier in the conversation, so we were already preparing ourselves for Rav Hutner. Okay, sorry. Yes, continue with Rav Hutner.
Rav Hutner did not spend time in England, but he spent time in so many other places that he said the midrash about Adam Harishon being created from Adamah, from the four corners of the earth, described him, that he was a child of Warsaw and a child of Eretz Yisrael and a child of Brooklyn. Right. So he has this just incredibly powerful mashal, and he's commenting on this idea that greater people arise in times of desolation, and his parable is of a teacher and students, and when the teacher speaks, the students listen and understand. But when the teacher is silent and it's fascinating, the English phrase, right, is buried in their thoughts. Right? I don't think I've ever thought about that metaphor, right? But to be buried in your thoughts. When the teacher is buried in their thoughts are that much deeper and more profound than when they are actually speaking. But most of the students only hear silence. It's a break in the communication. But says Rav Hutner, there is a certain talmid, there is a certain, individual who is so connected to their teacher that actually they are able to connect to the silence of their teacher. And the silence, in the silence of their teacher, more is communicated than when their teacher is speaking. The profoundness of that silence, I mean, that's just something to live with. In this particular reading, it's not something which is the exclusive preserve of Hasidic piety, but it's different moments of history, right?
Yeah.
The midrash that we quoted says there is binyana and there is chorbana. There is destruction, and there is when the temple is built and everything is as it should be, and it's Rav Hutner who then links in this mi kamocha be'ilmim, just as you anticipated, that God speaks in the good times and God is silent in the dark times, but that silence is only is not an end of the communication. It's a deeper communication, which there are those who are able to understand it and therefore achieve greater things with it. And I mean, Rav Hutner lived through some very, very dark times, and I think in certain ways this particular passage is his own commentary on the 20th century, actually. But that's for a separate podcast. The power of it this year is just, to me is so clear. I like this midrash every year, but this year, the idea that in the darkest times, when God feels ilem, the most remarkable things are witnessed and the greatest strength comes from people. And it's not simply because people fill the gap, right? That's one way of thinking about this. They take the initiative. Maybe that's like a certain read on Megillat Esther, but it's that this sort of, and I think we get into a certain sort of Israeli spirituality, which I think is very important to understand, that this is another opportunity to hear God and to see God. I'll give you one anecdote of mine, which from one of the most intense periods of the war. I shared with you at the start that we try to build a community which is very involved and invested in the city, and our city of Tel Aviv has been a part of the war. And within days of October 7th, there were tens of thousands of people arriving in the city from the south, and then shortly afterwards from the north, who were fleeing, and you could see very clearly who they were, and the hotels were filling up with them. And I remember it was October 7th was a Shabbat. It was 2 weeks after. It was Parshat Noach, October 21st. I was asked to give a shiur to a group of grandmothers from Sderot who were being evacuated. And it was one of the sort of most challenging things to think about in advance of what on earth do you... Firstly, I've never taught Moroccan grandmothers from Sderot before. They're not my normal audience. And secondly, what on earth do you say to them? And whatever I taught was not what was taught as important. But I asked... I was talking to one of them and I said... I was talking about her experiences, and she said, "Do you know what the hardest thing is?" I said, "No." She said, this is a woman in her 70s. She said, "This is the first time in my life that I have gone 2 weeks without doing hafrashat challah." And I was blown away and humbled by it. But this is a woman who lived close to the Sderot police station, who had half a dozen grandsons in the army at the time, and this silence of this way, the way in which she usually expressed such an important part of her religious life through hafrashat challah each week had been taken away from her. And I give that anecdote just as one very vivid one of how much of sort of spiritual depth and experience has been a part of this year. If you come to Tel Aviv, I don't know about Jerusalem, I imagine it might be a bit different. There is a tofa'ah, there is a phenomenon, which at first I thought I was like getting confused and blinking, but I've seen it so many dozens of times, of men who are clearly not classically religious, who do not wear kippot, who are tattooed, etc., who wear their tzitzit out. There is now a significant group of people who do not wear kippot, who wear their tzitzit, right? And we obviously see it in the music. The music has been so much an element of that.
So I just wanted to go back for a minute to this idea of the silence, because in the way that sort of we looked at it both initially, and I like it because we've done the same thing. You sort of the midrash, initial understanding of the midrash, and then you kind of can flip the midrash kind of on its head, which is great, and a great lesson in how to learn it, really. So the first is that silence al panav means that we feel like God isn't involved, like meaning God is someone who kind of can leave us alone. And that sometimes has an ironic advantage, as we learn from the pasuk, the midrash, and the pasuk in Yeshayahu, where that people can kind of step up when they feel that, well, God isn't there, so I'm going to step up. But the flip side of that really was that obviously God's silence doesn't mean that he's not there, right? God's silence means that he has a presence, and that part of our work is kind of to hear whatever that means. And I agree with you. It's like a spiritual work that looks different in different parts of the world, but to hear what it is that we're supposed to be hearing right now, like what is the message that we're supposed to get. And I also would say that to me also very much reflects kind of two different experiences that either two different kinds of people have had this year, or that one person has had in their own heart, both of these experiences. The experience where you feel like, I don't know, where's God in this moment? Where is he? Versus other people, even in the exact same moment, can look at that and say, Yad Hashem, meaning this is a moment where God is very present. And I feel like that question of, do I look at it as silence or do I look at it as quiet presence, is a question that kind of reflects itself in this emunah piece of like, what is my belief space in this moment? And I feel like this year also, people have taken that in different directions. As you said, sometimes it's like cause people to be more active in their avodat Hashem, whatever that means in the particular religious phenomenon that we see. And for other people, they feel, for very understandable reasons, feel abandoned by God, right? You are the El Ha'ilim. You are, know how to be mute in moments where I really would wish you would speak. And one piece I'll say, and I'm really curious what you have to say about that, okay? But one other piece I would say is that on the human side, is that often I feel that sometimes we need to learn from that muteness, meaning sometimes we too quickly offer words or say something. And I mean, this is such a silly thing. Like I just yesterday ran into a neighbor who this is a phenomenon in her speech. So I've learned to know just it's going to happen and be okay with it. But she's clearly this was like kind of how she was raised, but like, she's not great at just being like, oh, that sounds tough. She always bright sides it, like always, like she's like, oh, well, at least you would, when I was telling her that my kid fell and almost broke their foot and a kid got sick and we had gone away after waiting for like months to go. And it was whatever, it was a good weekend, but there were some she's like, oh, well, at least you went to go away. The point is that there sometimes, like it's an art to learn how to be quiet, meaning in those moments where we're not sure, is this God's silence or is this a communication? Really what most often needs to happen is there needs to be like a tremendous amount of listening and quiet in order for us to make that kind of determination. And so like sometimes I look at that and say, oh, I don't know what God is right now, but I think right now I need to be limit. Like right now I need to be quiet so that I can like ponder and like, people like to say meditate on, right? Like I can meditate on what's actually happening. So like that image of being silent for me both reflects the duality of how people can look at God's presence in the world. And to me, it also sometimes is instructive for how I want to be in the world. Does that make sense?
Totally. I think it's a beautiful model to think of. I mean, I taught a class last week in Tel Aviv about Moshe's muteness or Moshe's challenges with speech, and it's kind of a fascinating parallel here between there is something about it's so paradoxical. But what Moshe thinks is his barrier to leadership, clearly it's not a bug but a feature.
Yeah.
It's part of what God wants. The fact that he is not, the guy always talking.
Yeah. Totally. So I guess I want us together to look at one more midrashic teaching that obviously, as we're already seeing, is much more than understanding Kriyat Yam Suf. It's really also about understanding ourselves. But one more teaching of Chazal on this episode.
This one is just delightful. I think it's profound, but I think it's much simpler than the previous ones. This is a midrash in Shemot Rabbah, and it essentially says the following. So the sea is split, and Am Yisrael are walking through. And I remember my first childhood Haggadah, where it's like walking through an aquarium, right, with the fish.
Did you have Art Scroll in England? Is that this? Are we talking about the same one?
It may well have been.
Yeah, it's the red cover. Yeah. Totally.
Yes. Yes, exactly. But this midrash says actually something different is taking place. They're not sort of staring in wonder at the fishes and sort of overwhelmed by it. What are they doing? They are complaining about the mud on their shoes.
Yes.
Because despite the fact Hayam hofech liyabasha, that the sea had turned to dry land, but it wasn't actually dry, it's still pretty muddy, right? It's like walking on a path after it's been raining. And Reuven says to Shimon in the midrash, "B'mitzrayim betit u'b'yam tit," right? We had sort of mud in Egypt, and we've got mud here. And again, I think this is just a perfect example of something which it seems so childlike and playful, and I could tell my daughters this midrash, how muddy they got their shoes during Kriyat Yam Suf, and they were complaining about it. But I also think it's so profound. And its basic point is the most incredible miracles can be taking place right in front of your eyes, and all you notice is the mud on your shoes.
Okay, we're going to go deeper on that, but I just want to say one thing, which is that I think that there may be an interesting echo here about looking down versus looking up, because first of all, we know that the paradigm of Eretz Mitzrayim Kegan Yarak is it's the irrigated land because of the fertile overflow. And the whole point is that Hashem says, right, you have to look up to Hashem and not look down at your feet. And so there might be an echo here of that, but it's so often as what happens. Meaning, if you look, I'll say the opposite. If you're on a really difficult run, and you're going up a hill, the last thing you want to do is look up, because you don't want to know how much further it is. You want to just stick yourself in the moment so that before you know it, you're going to get to the top. But when you're in a moment of something that's so transcendent, you want to make sure to look up so that you don't miss the moment, right? If you get stuck looking down at your feet or getting lost, in the junk of your own complaining, then you're gonna miss the moment. So that's just one piece that comes out for me immediately that I think about. It's this Israel-Egypt paradigm, and they're right now obviously stuck in between those two places. They're Kivachol left Egypt, but they definitely haven't arrived yet in Israel, and they definitely haven't arrived yet from a mindset perspective. That'll take much longer.
Totally. So I just think this is just a midrash to live with. That the most incredible things can be taking place around you, and the determination to not miss it, to see the beautiful things that are taking place there. And to me, that's an imperative, not just for Am Yisrael then, but for all of us all the time, to appreciate what we have, right? I mean, now maybe we can come back to where we started. Yeah. Why do I like to approach this sort of episode through Midrash? Because we've only looked at 3 Midrashim, and there are many more. But, there's something astonishing here. That you've got Kriyat Yam Suf presented as the most wondrous, incredible thing, where the children on their mother's laps and even in their mother's wombs are having this moment of revelation, Zekeli v'Anvehu. And you've got it being turned into the most opposite thing of it's not about, God's overwhelming presence and bounty and goodness. It's about God's overwhelming silence. Mi kamocha be'ilamim. And then you've got lozeh v'lozeh. You've just got people walking through and missing the moment and only seeing the mud on their shoes. And it strikes me, I think this comes back to something you were saying earlier, that what the midrash is doing, it's kind of like slowing down the action very dramatically, and it's almost like journalists in the crowd, right? It says vayaminu b'Hashem, they as one in plural believed in God. Well, actually, let's talk to so and so. What are you thinking right now? And I thought of this phrase, and I used it in a drasha years ago, and I've never really done much with it, but I like to think with it that you can think about living midrashically. That to live midrashically means you're going through something very, very important, and that important thing that you're experiencing isn't going to have one message. It's going to have multiple messages. And it's going to have messages that you'll feel in the moment and messages that you'll only understand later. And the idea of sort of the unpacking of the multiple layers and unpacking them in our own lives of whatever we are experiencing seems to be captured for me through what the midrashim are doing here.
Yeah, no, I love that idea. I also love the reminder as we come closer to the Parsha that will be receiving the Torah. It reminds us of the importance of digging deeper in the midrashim. And just like Pshat study is so significant and needs to be done at all different ages because we often miss things, or we were taught to miss things. I think also delving into Torah Sheba'al Peh adds really, really needed like human contour and emotion and like connection with our realities that we can't always bridge that gap between what's written directly in the Torah and where that hits me. Meaning I could try and work really hard to make it resonant and relevant. But if I'm really trying to stick to the words of the Torah, it's sometimes very, very difficult. And I think that the expansions and the human experiential depth that Chazal are such masters at taking the text, sort of twisting it, flipping it inside out and upside down and coming out with something else is really a way that they're able, obviously, to see themselves and to help us see ourselves and our experiences in the Midrash through that unique prism of the text itself. So I really appreciate you sort of bringing us on this journey today through the Kiryat Yam Suf experience, which I'm really happy you brought these because they are like so resonant with our experiences over the past year and a half, both the triumphant and the challenging. So thank you so much for being here, Rabbi Joe Wolfson. And I'm so happy that you came on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode from Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. If you would like to sponsor an episode, please contact the Matan office or email me at podcast@matan.org.il. Please do us and all women's Torah learning a favor and share this episode with all of your friends and family.